when they were observed in the 1990 census. Right here, there's a score of 0.51 for this cohort, or approximate cohort. There's a small decline in segregation to 0.49 when they were observed 10 years later. And when we look at the rest of the bars, we see very, very small, slight cohort changes, but basically also that the newest immigrants, as might be predicted by spatial assimilation perspective, are more segregated than those who have been around a longer period of time. Here's the same graph. This looks at Hispanics, this time also by nativity. We see little change in the segregation of native-born Hispanics between 1990 and 2000. In both censuses, we also see that foreign-born Hispanics are more segregated than native-born Hispanics from whites, consistent with the predictions of the spatial assimilation perspective. Highest scores for the most recent arrivals, slight cohort changes over a 10-year period. This is the same graph for Asians. And again, a fairly general pattern here where the foreign-born are more segregated than native-born. A little higher for the most recent immigrants. We don't see quite a steep of a line here. Not as much difference between those who have been around longer than the most recent arrivals. Not too much change for cohorts here either. This shows for blacks by nativity. Among the native-born, there's a decline in segregation. But one thing you'll note here is very high levels. Again, the rule of thumb cutoff, again, was 0.6 for being very high. So these are very high segregation scores. Likewise, we see very high segregation scores among the foreign-born, even a little higher. Declines for both groups between 1990 and 2000. Here we don't really see much of a pattern by year of entry at all, and we do see small declines for these cohorts, but which I guess would be consistent with spatial assimilation, but rather overshadowed by these very high levels overall. And finally, this looks at the segregation of foreign-born whites from native-born whites. You'll see overall low to moderate levels, lowest of all for those who arrived before 1970, which are in the low range. Here's just showing one map of the Washington, D.C. Metropolitan area. The district, the central city, the District of Columbia itself, is this three-quarters diamond here. And this might be familiar for some of those who know the metropolitan area, but neighborhoods that are predominantly white in the district tend to be on the western part of the city, also in the suburbs and even the outer suburbs. Neighborhoods that are predominantly African American tend to be on the eastern side of the city and in Prince George's County to the east of the city. This particular map shows native-born non-Hispanic whites are the blue dots, and these are foreign-born Hispanics. Hispanics themselves are sort of in the middle part of the city and in some of the suburbs, not so much in some of the outer suburbs. You'll notice this is a dissimilarity score. This picture is when you calculate this dissimilarity score, it comes to 0.56 in the moderate, close to the high range. So keep this picture in mind, and then we'll look at the map for Asians. Here are these green dots. I hope they show up here. But Asians not so much in the central city itself, mainly dispersed in a lot of the inner suburbs, not quite so much in the outer suburbs, but this is a dissimilarity score in the moderate range of 0.43. Now here's a map of, again, whites, and this time it's black immigrants in the Washington metropolitan area. You have black immigrants in sort of the central portions of the city, and also to the east of the city, which are sometimes in or adjacent to predominantly sort of native-born black neighborhoods. You do have some dispersion across the inner suburbs. But overall, this comes out to a dissimilarity score of 0.64, which is in the high range. Finally, this shows white immigrants, and there are a bit fewer of them more generally. There are these orange dots you see here and there. Overall, widely distributed in the inner suburbs, not so much in the outer suburbs. This is a dissimilarity score of 0.34. This is to illustrate how some of the broader patterns translate into how things look in a particular city. I'll only briefly talk about the multivariate analysis, but basically what I'm interested here is to look at what explains the variation in residential segregation scores across different metropolitan areas. And here I'm interested in not only nativity, but other group characteristics like English language fluency. So this shows results for Hispanics. Basically, this first coefficient here is foreign-born Hispanics are more segregated than native-born Hispanics from whites. This reproduces the descriptive figures we saw before. In the second model, when we add other characteristics to the model, we see that in metropolitan areas where a greater proportion of Hispanics speak English well or very well, as opposed to poorly or not at all, segregation is less. This is consistent with predictions of spatial assimilation. More income, less segregation, and in fact, when we control for these characteristics, the coefficient for nativity for foreign-born goes away, suggesting that foreign-born are more segregated, in part because they have less English language fluency, lower income levels in the U.S. Finally, one more multivariate table. These numbers are the same as what we just looked at. For Asians, we see foreign-born more segregated, and these group characteristics work in much the same way. For blacks, we see actually fairly similar here. We do see that greater English fluency and median household income associated with lower levels of segregation. Overall, there's a lot of these patterns are broadly consistent with the spatial assimilation model. Foreign-born Hispanics, Asians, and blacks are more segregated from whites than the native-born. Immigrants in the U.S. for longer periods of time tend to be less segregated than recent arrivals. Many segregation patterns associated with group characteristics, income and English language fluency, segmented assimilation. Although we saw some patterns consistent with assimilation for blacks, we do see rather overshadowed by these extreme, very high levels of segregation. I just want to end with a couple of implications. Essentially, the support for spatial assimilation suggests less segregation over the longer run, especially as immigrants become more acculturated and gain in socioeconomic status. So, for example, we saw small increases in dissimilarity between 90 and 2000. This is in part reflecting large increases in segregation in the 1990s. We might see lower levels. The way this might play out over the longer run is lower levels. However, the many immigrants are of low socioeconomic status and have served to increase segregation, certainly at least in the short run. We also saw the very high levels of segregation of blacks and black immigrants. And there's always uncertainty associated with high levels of immigration and growth of particular groups. So just because we saw some of these patterns in the 1990s does not, of course, guarantee that we'll continue to see this in the coming years.
Merci, Professor.